My mother picked up my children from school without permission and took them to another state. When the police found them 3 days later, she said she was saving them from an abusive mother. The call from the school secretary informing me that my mother Sylvia had picked up Isabella and Miguel without any prior authorization while I was in a crucial work meeting impossible to interrupt arrived at exactly 2:37 p.m. on an ordinary Tuesday that instantly transformed into the worst nightmare any mother could experience, feeling my heart race so violently. I thought I was having a heart attack while slowly processing those impossible words that made no sense in the orderly reality I had carefully constructed over years protecting my 6- and 8-year-old children through safe and predictable routines that included a specific list of people authorized to pick them up from school. That definitely did not include my mother, after previous incidents demonstrating questionable judgment about appropriate boundaries with young children needing constant supervision and consistent structure. The absolute panic that exploded in my chest while holding my cell phone with hands shaking uncontrollably during that catastrophic call was different from any fear I had experienced previously in life, because it wasn't about an abstract threat or distant hypothetical danger, but rather concrete and devastating reality, where my 2 young children had been literally removed from a safe school environment by someone I knew intimately, but who had been progressively demonstrating during recent months increasingly erratic and concerning behaviors suggesting deterioration of judgment or perhaps something more sinister related to accumulated resentments about my growing independence, establishing my own family with healthy boundaries that she interpreted as unjustified personal rejection, deserving retaliation through dramatic actions designed to prove some obscure point about my supposed maternal inadequacy. My 37 years of carefully organized existence working as an architect in a respected firm, maintaining a functional marriage with Ricardo for 10 years, and mainly dedicating every available moment to ensuring that Isabella and Miguel grew up in a loving and structured environment, instantly crumbled when Secretary Andrea's tense voice explained over the phone that Sylvia had arrived at school at approximately 1 p.m. claiming an urgent family emergency requiring the children be released immediately under her care, convincingly presenting identification, proving she was the legitimate grandmother, and mainly emotionally manipulating less experienced staff through dramatic tears, and invented allegations about me having suffered a serious accident requiring immediate hospitalization where children needed to be present for final goodbyes in case prognosis was unfavorable. The cruel elaboration of that specific lie about me being hospitalized dying revealed Sylvia's intimate knowledge about exactly which narratives would be sufficiently convincing to make school staff violate established protocols about release of minors, only to explicitly authorize guardians in writing on forms signed annually during renewed enrollments, and mainly demonstrated a level of calculated premeditation, where she had consciously planned that kidnapping, elaborating a plausible story, capable of circumventing institutional safeguards designed precisely to prevent situations where vulnerable children were removed from safe environments by unauthorized adults, regardless of biological family relationships that did not automatically confer legal rights of custody or even unsupervised visitation. Andrea, my mother had absolutely no authorization to pick up my children, and mainly I didn't suffer any accident, as you can verify by the simple fact that I'm talking to you now perfectly healthy and conscious. I managed to articulate with voice progressively rising in volume, driven by growing panic rapidly transforming into absolute fury, directed both against Sylvia for having executed that cruel plan and against the school for having failed so spectacularly in protecting children under institutional responsibility during school hours. I need you to inform me immediately of all details about what happened, what time exactly my mother arrived, what specifically she said to convince staff to release my children, if anyone was with her, what type of vehicle she was driving, and mainly where she said she was taking the children. The desperate urgency in my voice finally penetrated Andrea's bureaucratic confusion as she began reporting fragmented details about how Sylvia had arrived alone, driving a dark-colored sedan that no one had registered the specific license plate, how she had cried copiously while insisting the situation was a critical medical emergency, not allowing delays for procedural verifications, and mainly how she had explicitly promised she would call me immediately after leaving school, to confirm children were safe under her temporary care, until I could eventually pick them up at the hospital, after emergency medical treatment I was supposedly receiving at a nearby facility never specified with sufficient precision to raise immediate suspicions from the manipulated staff. I hung up the phone after extracting all available details that were frustratingly insufficient to immediately locate my missing children, and literally ran through the hallways of the architecture firm, completely ignoring the important ongoing meeting where colleagues awaited presentations I had meticulously prepared during previous weeks, but which instantly became absolutely irrelevant compared to the devastating urgency of finding Isabella and Miguel before Sylvia could execute any next phase of the evidently premeditated plan that had begun with school kidnapping under elaborate false pretenses. Ricardo answered his cell on the second ring when I called frantically while running through the parking lot, desperately searching for my vehicle among dozens of parked cars that seemed identically anonymous through vision blurred by tears of absolute panic. "Ricardo, my mother kidnapped Isabella and Miguel from school an hour ago, claiming false medical emergency about me being hospitalized dying. The school released the children violating all protocols because she manipulated staff through elaborate lies, and now I can't contact her on any of the phones I have registered because apparently she turned off all cell phones anticipating we would try to track her immediately after discovering what she did." I explained, stumbling over words while finally locating my vehicle and struggling with keys shaking uncontrollably in hands sweaty with pure adrenaline. "I need you to leave work immediately and go straight to the nearest police station to file a formal report about kidnapping of minors while I go home to check if by some miracle she simply took the children there instead of executing a planned escape to unknown destination." Ricardo's shocked silence for 2 seconds processing the enormity of that impossible situation was quickly replaced by practical efficiency, characteristic of him during family crises, when he could suppress paralyzing emotions, focusing exclusively on concrete actions necessary to solve urgent problems. "Julia, take a deep breath and drive carefully home because a traffic accident caused by panic would only make the situation worse. I'll call the police station immediately reporting the kidnapping and mainly I'll activate contacts I have in the military police to initiate active search as soon as we have information about the vehicle your mother was driving and possible destinations she could be seeking," he instructed, with forcedly calm voice, masking his own terror about the safety of missing children. "After you get home and confirm they're not there, try to access your mother's email accounts and social media to look for any evidence of prior planning of this action that might indicate her destination or motivations. And mainly try to remember if she mentioned recently any specific place she wanted to visit or any particular person she was planning to meet." Ricardo's practical instructions offered minimal structure necessary to channel paralyzing panic into productive actions, while I drove at speeds slightly above legal limit through familiar streets that seemed unrecognizable through the fog of absolute terror dominating sensory perceptions where every wasted second represented greater distance Sylvia could be putting between my missing children and any possibility of quick recovery before the situation escalated to something even more dangerous than it obviously already was. The 20-minute drive to our house located in a quiet residential neighborhood was an agonizing eternity where my mind frantically processed memories from previous months, desperately searching for warning signs I should have recognized, anticipating that kidnapping before it could be executed. Approximately 3 months before that catastrophic Tuesday, Sylvia had casually mentioned during a family dinner that she was feeling progressively isolated and mainly not appreciated by the family she had dedicated her entire life to raising, sacrificing her own professional aspirations to ensure children had privileged childhoods with mother always available instead of constantly absent pursuing selfish careers. And although at that moment, I had interpreted those comments as simply normal expression of elderly person, reflecting on life choices and seeking retrospective validation, now with devastating perspective provided by current kidnapping, those words assumed sinister meaning about accumulated resentments gradually transforming into delusional convictions about having been unfairly marginalized by ungrateful daughter who established independent family with healthy boundaries interpreted as cruel rejection. I arrived home with tires squealing against the curb when I parked carelessly, partially blocking the garage entrance, and ran through the front door using keys with hands still shaking uncontrollably, shouting Isabella and Miguel's names while frantically searching through all rooms, even knowing rationally that if Sylvia had simply brought the children to my house, she certainly would have left an explanatory message, or at least answered the countless calls I had made during the desperate drive. The house was exactly as I had left it that morning during the rushed breakfast routine, preparing children for school before leaving for work. With dishes still in the sink awaiting washing I planned to do after returning that evening, toys scattered through the living room evidencing previous day's play session, and mainly absolute and oppressive silence that painfully confirmed my children definitely were not there safely awaiting my return. The devastating reality that Sylvia had really executed an elaborate kidnapping, taking Isabella and Miguel to completely unknown destination, finally began penetrating psychological defenses of denial I had maintained during the last hour, allowing minimal functioning through automatic actions instead of completely collapsing under the weight of the most primordial, maternal terror imaginable about vulnerable children under control of person demonstrating clearly compromised judgment. I sat heavily on the living room sofa, where just 11 hours earlier I had hugged and kissed Isabella and Miguel, wishing them a good school day before leaving for work, completely unaware that would be the last time I would see them for the next 3 days, that would reveal themselves to be a prolonged nightmare of desperate search involving multiple police agencies, coordinating efforts across state lines. I forced my mind to focus on the practical task Ricardo had suggested about accessing Sylvia's digital accounts, looking for evidence of prior planning. Opening my laptop and navigating to the email platform, where I still maintained access to her account from years earlier when I had helped set it up initially, and she had insisted I keep an emergency password in case she forgot how to access it or faced technical problems that elderly people frequently experience with digital technologies. The momentary guilt about invading my mother's digital privacy was quickly suppressed by the absolute urgency of locating any information that could help find my kidnapped children before the situation escalated to something irreversibly traumatic or even physically dangerous, depending on how compromised Sylvia's judgment was and what exactly were the motivations behind that drastic action. The email inbox revealed recent correspondence with lawyers specializing in rights of grandparents, allegedly alienated by controlling adult children. Multiple exchanges with online support groups promoting narratives about epidemic of parental alienation, where selfish mothers systematically distance loving grandmothers from legitimate relationships with grandchildren as form of cruel punishment for trivial family disagreements. And mainly an unsent draft of long and incoherent message, addressed to me detailing elaborate accusations about me being abusive mother, neglecting emotional needs of Isabella and Miguel, while prioritizing selfish professional career, exposing children to inadequate environments through daycares and schools where they were supervised by strangers instead of loving family, and mainly systematically refusing to allow her to exercise natural role of involved grandmother, providing superior care that only blood relatives could offer with unconditional love impossible to replicate through depersonalized institutional arrangements. The discovery of that unsent message revealing disturbing depth of Sylvia's delusional convictions about my supposed maternal inadequacy was a moment of devastating clarity where I finally understood that the kidnapping of my children had not been simply an impulsive act of concerned grandmother, but rather culmination of months of progressive psychological deterioration, systematically fed by toxic narratives of radicalized online communities, promoting ideological war against adult children, allegedly conspiring to alienate elderly parents from legitimate relationships with grandchildren through cruel manipulations disguised as healthy boundaries necessary for independent and autonomous family functioning. The extensive draft that Sylvia had begun writing but apparently never gathered sufficient courage to send detailed, elaborate list of supposed maternal failures I allegedly committed daily against Isabella and Miguel, including absurd accusations about emotional neglect, because I worked full-time instead of dedicating every conscious moment exclusively to children's needs, about exposure to inadequate environments through enrollment in private school instead of homeschooling supervised by family, and mainly about systematic refusal to allow her to exercise natural role of primary grandmother, providing superior care that only blood relatives could offer with unconditional love, impossible to replicate through teachers, nannies, or other hired professional caregivers. The specific language used in Sylvia's draft echoed phraseology characteristic of online forums dedicated to grandparents' rights, where participants shared elaborate strategies to document evidence of supposed parental alienation, build legal cases for forced visitation or even shared custody, and mainly mutually validate feelings of victimization through collective narratives about modern epidemic of selfish adult children systematically excluding elderly parents from grandchildren's lives as form of cruel punishment for trivial disagreements, or simply for desire of family independence interpreted as unjustified personal rejection, deserving dramatic retaliation designed to publicly expose supposed abuses and restore relationships through legal interventions or even extra-legal ones, when judicial system failed to recognize severity of situation as unilaterally defined by grandparents, convinced of their own distorted narratives. I saved complete copy of that unsent email and all correspondence with lawyers and online support groups that Sylvia had maintained during previous months, immediately sending documentation to Ricardo, and mainly to the police station where I would need to file formal report about kidnapping of minors before more time passed, creating possibilities of Sylvia crossing state lines, making location and recovery of children progressively more difficult through multiple police jurisdictions, requiring complex coordination between agencies that frequently moved with frustrating bureaucratic slowness during family emergencies where every wasted hour represented greater physical distance and mainly greater psychological trauma for vulnerable children under control of adult demonstrating judgment, clearly compromised by delusional convictions about non-existent family conspiracy. The 15-minute drive to nearest police station located in busy commercial neighborhood was a surreal experience where I drove automatically through familiar streets, while my mind frantically processed devastating implications of discovery about Sylvia's progressive radicalization through toxic online communities. Trying to reconstruct chronology of psychological deterioration, I had failed to recognize during previous months when warning signs had been present, but were rationalized as simply normal eccentricities of elderly person adjusting to changes in family dynamics after establishment of my independent family, with appropriate boundaries about frequency of visitations and mainly about parental autonomy in decisions about raising Isabella and Miguel, without constant interference from well-intentioned but excessively involved relatives. Approximately 6 months before that catastrophic kidnapping, Sylvia had begun making increasingly critical comments about my parenting choices. During weekly family dinners we maintained as commitment to preserve relationship between grandmother and grandchildren, questioning decisions about children's sleep schedules, food choices I allowed, amount of screen time I authorized, and mainly educational philosophy I embraced, prioritizing development of independence and critical thinking instead of absolute obedience and conformity with rigid adult expectations that Sylvia had valued during her own motherhood experience decades earlier, operating under different cultural paradigms about relationships between parents and children, characterized by authoritarian hierarchies instead of collaborative partnerships. At the time, I had interpreted those growing critical comments as simply normal generational differences about child rearing philosophies where grandparents raised under more authoritarian paradigms naturally experience discomfort with more permissive contemporary approaches, valuing children's autonomy and authentic emotional expression instead of silent conformity with unquestionable adult authority, but now with devastating perspective provided by discovery of correspondence with radicalized grandparents' rights groups. Those comments assumed sinister meaning as evidence of paranoid narrative developing progressively, where each parenting choice I made was reinterpreted through distorted lens as additional evidence of maternal inadequacy, eventually justifying dramatic intervention designed to save children from allegedly abusive mother through extra-legal methods when gentle persuasion attempts failed to alter behaviors that existed only in Sylvia's delusional imagination, systematically fed by online communities, mutually validating distorted perceptions. The police station was typical institutional building with deteriorated gray facade, internal walls painted in faded beige tone, characteristic of government facilities operating under limited budgets, and mainly oppressive atmosphere of slow bureaucracy processing endless human tragedies through standardized forms incapable of adequately capturing emotional complexities of impossible situations like kidnapping of children by psychologically compromised grandmother, operating under delusional convictions about saving grandchildren from abusive mother, instead of traumatizing them through forced removal from safe family environment and structured routines that provided fundamental emotional stability for healthy development of 6 and 8 year old children, still forming basic understandings about reliability of adults and predictability of surrounding world. Detective Fernanda, who handled my case, was a 45-year-old black woman with curly hair tied in low professional ponytail, brown eyes demonstrating that particular combination of human compassion and practical efficiency, characteristic of experienced police officers who had processed countless cases of complex family crises during careers dedicated to protecting vulnerable people against abuses frequently perpetrated by close people instead of dangerous strangers who dominated popular imagination about threats to child safety, when statistically greatest danger came from within family circles, where power dynamics, accumulated resentments, and mainly untreated psychological disorders created conditions for devastating violence disguised as protective love or legitimate concern about children's welfare. Ma'am, I need you to report with maximum possible detail everything that happened from the moment you discovered your children had been removed from school without your authorization until now, including any information about the vehicle your mother was driving, clothes the children were wearing when taken, possible destinations she could be seeking based on recent conversations or places she mentioned wanting to visit, and mainly any documentary evidence about her mental state that might indicate if children are in immediate danger beyond obvious psychological trauma of being separated from mother through elaborate kidnapping. Detective Fernanda instructed with professional but compassionate voice while preparing official incident report form on antiquated computer that processed information with frustrating slowness inadequate for urgency of situation, where every wasted minute represented greater distance Sylvia could be putting between my missing children and any possibility of quick recovery. During the following hour, I meticulously reported entire sequence of events from catastrophic call from school secretary to discovery of revealing correspondence in Sylvia's email, documenting progressive radicalization through toxic online communities, promoting paranoid narratives about grandparents' alienation, trying to maintain professional composure despite growing panic about safety of Isabella and Miguel under control of person clearly, operating under delusional convictions about saving them from abusive mother, instead of traumatizing them through actions that young children did not possess cognitive capacity to rationally understand, experiencing only primordial terror of forced separation from primary maternal figure, who represented fundamental emotional security in world that had suddenly revealed itself to be much more unpredictable and dangerous than they had previously experienced in protected existences of privileged childhood. Detective Fernanda remained in professional silence during my detailed narrative, occasionally asking specific technical questions about exact chronology, physical characteristics of Sylvia and children for dissemination in police alerts, information about vehicle including make, model, color, and mainly license plate if I knew it, and details about possible destinations based on places Sylvia had recently mentioned, or relatives in other cities or states she could seek as refuge during planned escape from local jurisdiction, where she would be more easily located through coordinated police operations. When I finally finished exhaustive report, Detective Fernanda breathed deeply, processing implications of that impossible situation that transcended simple custody categories into more sinister territory of possible parental kidnapping, with concerning psychological components suggesting Sylvia genuinely believed she was protecting children instead of traumatizing them. Ms. Julia, I will immediately initiate procedures for issuing alert to all state police stations, and mainly to highway patrols monitoring main highways leaving this region, including physical descriptions of your mother and Isabella and Miguel, vehicle characteristics, if we can identify through property records associated with her address, and mainly classification of this case as high-risk parental kidnapping due to documentary evidence you brought about kidnapper's compromised mental state, suggesting possible danger to children if she experiences psychotic or dissociative episode when confronted by police authorities. Detective Fernanda explained while rapidly typing information into computerized system connected to state and national police networks. Additionally, I will contact juvenile court requesting emergency issuance of search and seizure order, authorizing police to immediately remove children from your mother's custody when located and return them to you as legitimate legal guardian, and mainly restraining order prohibiting any future contact between your mother and your children until complete psychiatric evaluation is conducted, determining if she represents continuing danger. Detective Fernanda's words offered some procedural structure for impossible situation, but simultaneously confirmed absolute severity of kidnapping where my children were under control of person whom police authorities considered sufficiently unstable to represent potential danger beyond obvious psychological trauma of forced separation from mother through elaborate manipulation of school staff using lies about false medical emergency. The official classification as high-risk parental kidnapping instead of simply family custody dispute accelerated police procedures, but also revealed that experienced professionals in family crises considered Sylvia sufficiently psychologically compromised to justify serious concern about immediate physical safety of children and not just long-term emotional well-being. Detective, how long does it generally take to locate children in parental kidnapping cases, when kidnapper had approximately 3 hours head start before police alert is issued? I asked, trying to control tremor in voice that threatened to reveal paralyzing panic only partially suppressed through focus on practical tasks and bureaucratic procedures, offering illusion of control over fundamentally impossible situation where my children were in completely unknown location, under care of person demonstrating judgment clearly compromised by delusional convictions. Detective Fernanda hesitated briefly before responding with compassionate but realistic honesty characteristic of professionals, who learned that false hopes frequently caused more psychological damage than difficult truths presented with appropriate empathy. Statistically, majority of parental kidnapping cases where kidnapper is close relative without history of physical violence result in safe recovery of children within 72 hours through location via tracking of credit cards, cell phones, security cameras at commercial establishments, or mainly through voluntary contact by kidnapper when logistical reality of caring for young children without adequate resources becomes unsustainable. Detective Fernanda explained, maintaining professional but compassionate voice. However, I need to be honest that cases involving kidnappers operating under delusional convictions about saving children from abusive situations tend to be more complicated because person genuinely believes they are doing right thing, and therefore may take more elaborate measures to avoid police detection, including deactivating cell phone tracking, avoiding use of credit cards, and mainly seeking refuge with accomplices who share paranoid narratives validating kidnappers' actions. Detective Fernanda's realistic explanation about complexities of locating kidnappers operating under delusional convictions intensified panic I had tried to suppress during last hour through focus on bureaucratic procedures, forcing confrontation with devastating possibility that Isabella and Miguel could remain missing for days or potentially weeks if Sylvia had planned escape with sufficient sophistication to avoid tracking through conventional police methods dependent on kidnappers eventually making logistical mistakes revealing locations through financial transactions, phone communications, or mainly through contact with family social networks that inevitably notified authorities about whereabouts of missing children. Is there anything additional I can do besides simply waiting for police procedures to locate my children? Some way to track my mother's cell phone even if she deactivated it, or access her browsing history looking for evidence of prior planning that might indicate specific destination? I asked desperately, looking for any concrete action I could execute instead of remaining passively awaiting bureaucratic system to process case through official channels, moving with slowness inadequate for urgency of situation, where every hour represented greater psychological trauma for young children, confused about why they had been suddenly removed from safe and familiar routines by grandmother making incomprehensible allegations about saving them from mother, who represented only source of consistent emotional security, in lives still forming basic understandings about reliability of adults. Detective Fernanda considered my question carefully before responding with that characteristic combination of police professionalism and human empathy about impossible family situations. Technically, cell phone tracking requires judicial warrant based on evidence of immediate danger, but given we already classified this case as high risk parental kidnapping due to documentary evidence about kidnappers' compromised mental state, I can request emergency warrant that is generally approved within 2 to 4 hours, allowing access to real-time location of cell phone registered in your mother's name, she explained methodically. Additionally, you mentioned having access to her email where you found revealing correspondence about radicalization through online groups. I suggest you continue examining those communications, looking for any specific mention of places, people, or mainly escape plans she may have discussed with participants of those forums that frequently encourage dramatic actions, including temporary disappearance with grandchildren, to force recognition of supposed parental alienation. Detective Fernanda's practical instructions offered minimal structure necessary to channel paralyzing despair into productive actions while awaiting official police procedures to process through multiple bureaucracies, but simultaneously confirmed that recovery of Isabella and Miguel probably would not be matter of hours, but rather days requiring psychological endurance. I honestly did not know if I possessed to withstand prolonged uncertainty about safety of my vulnerable children under control of person demonstrating judgment, fundamentally compromised by delusional convictions about non-existent family conspiracy. I thank Detective Fernanda for professional response, and mainly for appropriate classification of case severity, promising to maintain constant contact and immediately inform of any additional discovery through continued examination of Sylvia's digital correspondence. The return drive home after completing formal incident report and providing all available information for police procedures was a surreal experience, where I drove automatically through familiar streets while my mind frantically processed implications of official classification as high-risk parental kidnapping, trying simultaneously to maintain some hope about quick and safe recovery of Isabella and Miguel, while psychologically preparing for devastating possibility of days or weeks of search through multiple police jurisdictions before finally locating and recovering children, probably permanently traumatized by experience of forced separation, and mainly by exposure to Sylvia's delusional narratives about my supposed maternal inadequacy that even young children would partially absorb, causing lasting damage to fundamental maternal relationship. Ricardo called when I was approximately 5 minutes from home, his tense voice revealing he had also completed procedures at police station where he went personally after receiving my emails with documentation extracted from Sylvia's account, and mainly after emotionally processing enormity of situation where his children had been kidnapped by grandmother operating under delusional convictions fed by progressive online radicalization, through toxic communities promoting ideological war against adult children, establishing independent families with healthy boundaries, interpreted as cruel parental alienation deserving dramatic retaliation. Julia, I also called. Dr. Henrique, that attorney specializing in family law who worked with us during adoption process years ago, and explained complete situation including kidnapping, evidence of online radicalization, and mainly police classification as high-risk case. Ricardo reported with controlled voice, masking his own panic about children's safety. Enrique said he will immediately prepare petition for emergency exclusive custody, completely removing any visitation rights your mother could claim to have, and mainly will request compulsory psychiatric evaluation of her when located to determine if she represents continuing danger to children, or if she could eventually have supervised contact after appropriate psychiatric treatment restores connection with objective reality. Ricardo's words about legal procedures necessary to protect Isabella and Miguel after recovery offered some procedural structure, but simultaneously confirmed that kidnapping would permanently transform family dynamics, creating irreparable divisions where my own mother would be legally classified as potential threat to my children, requiring formal judicial interventions instead of simply informal agreements between functional adults about appropriate boundaries of relationship between grandmother and grandchildren. The devastating sadness about loss of maternal relationship that would never be restored even after resolution of immediate crisis, mixed with justified fury about Sylvia's conscious choices to participate in radicalized communities, internalize paranoid narratives, and mainly execute elaborate kidnapping, traumatizing her own grandchildren through actions based on delusions instead of objective reality of our perfectly functional family relationship operating under healthy boundaries, appropriate for independent nuclear family. I arrived home finding oppressive silence that contrasted painfully with cheerful chaos, characteristic of normal afternoons, when Isabella and Miguel returned from school filling space with laughter, animated conversations about school events, and mainly that vibrant children's energy that transformed house into living home instead of simply physical structure containing furniture and inanimate objects. The children's physical absence was palpable, creating emotional void that seemed to suck oxygen from air, making it difficult to breathe adequately while I walked through rooms full of evidence of their recent presences. School backpacks still in hallway where they had left them that morning during rushed breakfast routine. Toys scattered through living room evidencing previous night's play session. Colorful drawings hung on refrigerator through decorative magnets showing children's interpretations of our family, including figure of grandmother Sylvia, still drawn with smiles and hearts before relationship deteriorated through progressive radicalization. I forced my mind to return to laptop and continue systematic examination of Sylvia's correspondence, looking for any additional evidence about escape planning, or mainly about specific destinations she could be seeking. Navigating through hundreds of emails exchanged with participants in grandparents' rights forums, where language progressively radicalized during months prior to kidnapping, through mutual validation of paranoid narratives about conspiracy of adult children, systematically alienating elderly parents from legitimate relationships with grandchildren. One particularly revealing email dated approximately 2 weeks before kidnapping discussed specific strategies to document evidence of supposed maternal neglect through observations during visitations, photograph any aspect of home environment that could be interpreted as inadequate for children, and mainly create records of interactions where supposedly abusive mothers demonstrated problematic behaviors that participants of those forums considered evidence of parental inadequacy, eventually justifying dramatic intervention to save children from allegedly abusive environments. Even when described behaviors were simply normal manifestations of contemporary motherhood operating under different paradigms from those that had dominated previous generations, raising children under authoritarian rather than collaborative philosophies based on mutual respect and development of age. Appropriate children's autonomy. The specific message that captured my attention with particular intensity was exchanged between Sylvia and forum participant, identified only as anonymous user, discussing details about how to execute temporary disappearance with grandchildren to force official recognition of supposed parental alienation through creation of crisis that would force judicial system to finally investigate allegations that had been supposedly ignored by authorities uninterested in protecting grandparents' rights, systematically marginalized by legislation, excessively favoring biological parents, even when they demonstrated obvious maternal inadequacy, through selfish choices prioritizing careers, instead of fundamental emotional needs of young children requiring constant presence of maternal figure, dedicated exclusively to children's well-being. The guidance provided by that anonymous participant included specific instructions about how to avoid police tracking through deactivation of cell phones, exclusive use of cash instead of credit cards that created digital records of transactions easily accessible by authorities, choice of destinations in different states where multiple police jurisdictions would complicate search coordination, and mainly about how to prepare convincing narratives to present to children about reasons for sudden trip that would minimize children's resistance, and mainly create perception that separation from mother was temporary and justified by emergency circumstances instead of permanent kidnapping based on delusions about maternal inadequacy that had no foundation in objective reality of perfectly functional family relationship. I saved complete copy of that revealing message and immediately forwarded it to Detective Fernanda through email attaching additional documentation that could help locate Sylvia through analysis of communication patterns with participants of those forums who potentially could be providing refuge or logistical assistance during planned escape, creating network of accomplices operating under shared convictions about epidemic of parental alienation, justifying extra-legal actions when judicial system failed to recognize severity of situation as unilaterally defined by grandparents radicalized through online echo chambers, mutually validating distorted perceptions about conspiracy of adult children against elderly parents deserving unlimited access to grandchildren, regardless of boundaries established by biological parents exercising legitimate autonomy over child. Rearing decisions. Detective Fernanda responded to email within 15 minutes, confirming receipt of additional documentation, and mainly informing that technical team was analyzing metadata from those messages, looking to identify geographic location of forum participants who had provided specific guidance about executing escape with grandchildren, potentially revealing organized network of individuals facilitating parental kidnappings through provision of safe havens. Financial resources, and mainly psychological validation of delusional narratives that allowed kidnappers to rationalize traumatic actions against own grandchildren as forms of loving protection, instead of devastating psychological abuse, based on paranoid convictions about inadequacy of perfectly competent biological parents operating under contemporary child. Rearing philosophies that simply differed from authoritarian paradigms of previous generations. The following hours after that discovery of revealing correspondence were a period of agonizing waiting where I alternated between obsessively examining additional emails from Sylvia, looking for any clue about specific destination, and mainly compulsively checking cell phone expecting call from Detective Fernanda announcing successful location of Isabella and Miguel through tracking approved by emergency judicial warrant, or mainly through anonymous tip from person having cited elderly grandmother with 2 young children, matching descriptions disseminated through state police alerts to highway patrols and police stations in cities along main escape routes leaving our metropolitan region. Ricardo arrived home at approximately 7 p.m. that evening, finding me still sitting in front of laptop, frantically examining Sylvia's digital correspondence, while cell phone remained beside, vibrating occasionally with notifications of messages from relatives and friends who had discovered about kidnapping through social media, where we had posted photographs of Isabella and Miguel requesting that anyone having information about their whereabouts contact police immediately, or directly us through numbers provided, along with detailed physical descriptions of children, and mainly of Sylvia, including clothes they probably would be wearing based on observations of school staff during unauthorized removal occurring approximately 6 hours earlier, but that seemed like eternity of psychological anguish. Julia, you need to try to rest a bit and mainly eat something because physical collapse caused by exhaustion would only make situation worse when we finally locate children, and you need to be functional to receive them, and mainly to help them process trauma of forced separation through elaborate kidnapping, Ricardo suggested gently, while placing comforting hand on my tense shoulder, observing laptop screens still displaying Sylvia's emails, detailing months of progressive radicalization through toxic online communities. Detective Fernanda called me 30 minutes ago informing that judicial warrant for cell phone tracking was approved and technical team already initiated procedures to locate last signal from phone registered in your mother's name, so we'll probably have information about approximate location within next few hours. Ricardo's words about approval of judicial warrant offered first concrete sign of progress in location efforts after hours of agonizing waiting where only productive action had been obsessively examining Sylvia's digital correspondence, looking for clues about planned destination, but simultaneously confirmed that recovery of Isabella and Miguel was still potentially hours away, depending on how long it would take to track cell phone signal, and mainly to coordinate police rescue operation when location was finally identified through triangulation of cell phone towers recording last contact with device before being deactivated, as per instructions provided by online forum participants advising about how to avoid tracking during escapes with kidnapped grandchildren. I tried to follow Ricardo's suggestion about resting and eating, but quickly discovered that both sleep and appetite were impossible, while my children remained missing under control of person demonstrating judgment fundamentally compromised by delusional convictions. So instead, I remained awake during that entire first night of kidnapping, alternating between compulsively examining additional correspondence from Sylvia and mainly obsessively checking phone, expecting news from Detective Fernanda about progress in tracking or tips through alerts disseminated to state police monitoring highways and commercial establishments, where Sylvia could eventually stop for refueling or mainly for overnight stay if she had planned long trip through multiple states, creating maximum distance from our city before establishing temporary refuge. The call that finally arrived at 4:23 a.m. that impossible morning was from Detective Fernanda informing that cell phone tracking had identified last signal from phone registered in Sylvia's name approximately 185 miles north of our city in small rural locality near state border, suggesting she was executing planned escape through less monitored route, avoiding main highways where police alerts had been disseminated, with greater intensity focusing patrols on main traffic arteries instead of secondary roads crossing rural areas, with less systematic police presence but offering alternative routes for crossing state borders, complicating search coordination through multiple jurisdictions. Ms. Julia, I coordinated with State Police Station responsible for region where last cell phone signal was detected, and local patrols are already checking commercial establishments including gas stations, restaurants, and mainly small hotels or inns where elderly women traveling with 2 young children could have stayed overnight after approximately 5 hours of travel since unauthorized school removal. Detective Fernanda explained with professional voice, maintaining encouraging but realistic tone about complexities of locating person, potentially taking refuge in extensive rural area, with limited infrastructure of security cameras or digital transaction records that would facilitate tracking in more densely technologically monitored urban environments. Based on chronology of last detected signal at approximately 7 p.m. yesterday, I estimate your mother probably stayed overnight in that region and may still be there, or alternatively continued travel during early morning seeking to cross state border before alerts were widely disseminated to adjacent jurisdiction. The information about Sylvia's approximate location offered first concrete progress after 10 hours of absolute anguish, but simultaneously revealed she had managed to travel substantial distance before tracking was approved and initiated, creating worrying possibility she could have already crossed state border, establishing herself in different jurisdiction, where search coordination would require involvement of additional police agencies, moving through multiple bureaucracies with characteristic slowness, of government systems operating under rigid protocols inadequate for urgency of family emergencies, where every wasted hour represented greater psychological trauma for vulnerable children, confused about reasons for sudden separation from safe family routines, and mainly from maternal figure, representing only source of consistent emotional stability in lives still forming basic understandings about reliability of adults. Ricardo and I immediately decided to travel to that region where last signal from Sylvia's cell phone had been detected, instead of remaining passively awaiting police procedures to locate children through systematic verifications of commercial establishments in extensive rural area with limited infrastructure, feeling desperate need to be physically close to location where Isabella and Miguel probably had stayed overnight just hours before, and mainly hoping our active presence could accelerate searches through parallel verifications at establishments that local police might not prioritize due to limited resources of small rural police stations simultaneously processing multiple cases in community with reduced population but extensive geographic territory requiring patrols covering substantial distances. The 3-hour drive to that rural locality was conducted in tense silence, broken only occasionally by phone calls to Detective Fernanda, checking progress in verifications of commercial establishments, and mainly confirming we were coordinating our trip with official police operations, instead of potentially interfering with procedures that could be compromised by presence of emotionally charged parents, during confrontation with potentially unstable kidnapper, when finally located with children under unauthorized custody. Dawn arrived while we drove through progressively sparser rural landscapes, replacing urban density of our city, with extensive agricultural fields occasionally punctuated by small communities characterized by simple architecture and mainly by that quality of rural life, where everyone knew everyone, creating informal social networks, where presence of unknown elderly grandmother traveling with 2 young children certainly would be noticed by local residents observing uncommon visitors in community, rarely receiving strangers. We arrived at that small rural locality at approximately 8 a.m. on second day of kidnapping, finding modest police station functioning in simple single-story building with only 3 police officers constituting complete security force responsible for patrolling extensive geographic territory, covering multiple dispersed communities connected by poorly paved secondary roads, crossing agricultural landscapes dominated by seasonal plantations. And mainly by that quality of isolation characteristic of rural areas, where urban services including cell phone coverage were irregular, creating zones without signal, where digital tracking became impossible, forcing dependence on traditional investigation methods based on testimonies from local residents possibly having sighted elderly women with children during passage through region. The officer responsible for coordinating searches in that rural jurisdiction was a man of approximately 50 years named Sergio, with extensive experience in complex family cases, characteristic of small communities where everyone knew neighbors' personal stories, creating dynamics where domestic conflicts were frequently resolved through informal mediations instead of formal legal interventions, but who demonstrated appropriate understanding of severity of that parental kidnapping, transcending simple family disputes into territory of possible substantial psychological danger to children, under control of grandmother operating under delusional convictions fed by progressive online radicalization through toxic communities promoting paranoid narratives about conspiracy of adult children against elderly parents. Mr. Ricardo and Ms. Julia, based on cell phone signal tracking and mainly on verifications we conducted during early morning at commercial establishments along main road crossing our region, we identified that woman matching physical description of Sylvia stayed overnight at Small Family Inn located approximately 9 miles north of here, accompanied by 2 children whom proprietor described as appearing tired but without obvious signs of physical suffering. Hi. Officer Sergio informed with encouraging tone, offering first concrete confirmation that Isabella and Miguel had been sighted recently, and mainly that they appeared to be physically safe despite obvious psychological trauma of forced separation from mother through elaborate kidnapping. However, when patrol was sent to that inn at approximately 6 a.m. this morning, after receiving tip from proprietor who became suspicious about situation when she noticed news on social media about missing children, we discovered Sylvia had departed during early morning, paying in cash and leaving inn before dawn, suggesting she was monitoring police alerts and decided to continue escape before search net tightened in that specific region. The news simultaneously encouraging about Isabella and Miguel having been sighted appearing physically safe and devastatingly frustrating about Sylvia having escaped hours before patrol arrived at that inn created emotional mixture of partial relief and mainly renewed anguish about possibility of search, prolonging through multiple jurisdictions while she continued fleeing through secondary routes, avoiding detection until establishing more permanent refuge in locations sufficiently distant from our city, where she believed she could remain hidden with children until judicial system was forced to recognize her allegations about my supposed maternal inadequacy through crisis created by kidnapping, transforming private family dispute into public case, requiring official investigation of accusations she had been unable to validate through normal legal channels, operating under standards of objective evidence instead of delusional convictions. Officer Sergio, did proprietor provide any information about direction my mother took when departing during early morning, or mainly about children's emotional state during overnight stay that could indicate if they are being kept through coercion, or if my mother managed to convince them that trip is temporary and justified for legitimate reasons instead of kidnapping based on delusions about maternal inadequacy? I asked, trying to extract any additional detail that could help better understand psychological dynamic between Sylvia and Isabella and Miguel during first 24 hours of kidnapping, that certainly would be marked by children's confusion about reasons for sudden separation from family routines and mainly by gradual processing of reality, that return home might not be as immediate as Sylvia probably had promised during initial school removal using narratives about false medical emergency. Officer Sergio consulted notes in notebook before responding with details proprietor had provided during interview with Morning Patrol. According to proprietor's report, children appeared confused and mainly older boy repeatedly asked when they could return home and see their mother, while Sylvia consistently responded they needed to stay with her for a few days because you were busy with work and had asked her to care for them temporarily during period of professional overload. He explained, revealing Sylvia was using relatively benign narrative with children instead of immediately exposing them to delusional accusations about my supposed maternal inadequacy. Proprietor also mentioned Sylvia seemed tense and compulsively checked cell phone until completely deactivating it during night, and mainly that she insisted on paying everything in cash, refusing to provide identification documents as normally required by lodging registries, raising suspicions that eventually motivated proprietor to check social media, where she discovered alerts about missing children. The description of Sylvia's behavior confirmed she was consciously avoiding tracking through digital transactions and official records as advised by online forum participants, providing instructions about executing escapes with kidnapped grandchildren, but also revealed she was still using relatively neutral narratives with Isabella and Miguel, instead of immediately exposing them to complete versions of delusional convictions about family conspiracy, suggesting perhaps some residual level of consciousness about inadequacy of involving young children in adult conflicts based on distorted perceptions, instead of objective reality of perfectly functional family relationships, operating under healthy boundaries appropriate for independent nuclear family. Officer Sergio organized coordinated operation involving additional patrols requested from neighboring police stations to systematically verify commercial establishments along all possible routes Sylvia could be using to continue escape through that rural region, particularly focusing on secondary roads leading to state border where she apparently was trying to cross to further complicate search coordination through multiple police jurisdictions operating under different bureaucratic systems, requiring formal approvals for interstate cooperation in parental kidnapping cases even when classified as high risk due to evidence of kidnappers' psychological compromise representing potential danger to emotional and possibly physical safety of children under unauthorized custody. Ricardo and I spent that entire second day of kidnapping accompanying patrols through that rural region, personally visiting commercial establishments showing photographs of Sylvia and mainly of Isabella and Miguel to proprietors and staff who might have cited elderly grandmother traveling with 2 young children during previous hours. Feeling desperate need to actively contribute to searches instead of remaining passively awaiting official police procedures to locate children through systematic verifications that moved with characteristic slowness of operations involving extensive geographic territory, with limited communication infrastructure, and mainly with scarce human resources of rural police stations, operating under restricted budgets, inadequate for complex emergencies, requiring mobilization of multiple patrols simultaneously. The growing frustration of checking dozens of establishments without obtaining any confirmation of recent sighting of Sylvia and children created progressive sensation of hopelessness about possibilities she had managed to cross state border, establishing herself in adjacent jurisdiction, where searches would need to restart through coordination with different police agencies operating under bureaucratic protocols that inevitably would introduce additional delays while my children remained missing under control of person demonstrating judgment compromised by delusional convictions systematically fed during months of online radicalization through toxic communities mutually validating paranoid perceptions about conspiracy of adult children against elderly parents deserving unlimited access to grandchildren regardless of boundaries established by biological parents. The breakthrough that finally brought resolution to that prolonged nightmare arrived at approximately 5 p.m. that second day when we received call from Officer Sergio informing that Sylvia had been located at small isolated rural property approximately 25 miles beyond state border, where apparently she had established temporary refuge with assistance from participant of those online grandparents' rights forums who operated informal sanctuary for grandparents fleeing with kidnapped grandchildren during custody disputes or allegations of parental alienation. Literally creating organized network of accomplices, facilitating kidnappings through provision of safe shelters where kidnappers could remain hidden while trying to establish legal narratives about inadequacy of biological parents justifying removal of children from primary custodies. Mr. Ricardo and Ms. Julia, I coordinated with adjacent state police station and patrol has already been dispatched to that rural property where reliable informant confirmed presence of elderly woman matching description of Sylvia, accompanied by 2 young children arriving at that location during early morning after additional travel through state border. Officer Sergio explained with tone simultaneously relieved about successful location and cautious about complexities of executing children's rescue from property potentially defended by proprietors sympathetic to grandparents' rights narratives, and mainly about need to approach situation with appropriate sensitivity to avoid violent confrontation that could further traumatize Isabella and Miguel, already affected by 48 hours of forced separation from primary maternal figure. I will request you wait at police station while patrol executes rescue operation, because parents' presence during initial confrontation with kidnapper could emotionally escalate situation, creating additional risks for children's safety if Sylvia reacts defensively when confronted by police authorities. The instruction to wait at police station while rescue operation was executed was simultaneously frustrating by preventing our presence during crucial moment of recovering Isabella and Miguel, and rationally understandable given that emotional confrontation between me and Sylvia during Rescue could really create additional risks if she experienced dissociative episode when confronted with collapse of delusional narrative she had meticulously constructed during months justifying kidnapping. As protective action instead of traumatic abuse against own grandchildren based on paranoid convictions about non-existent maternal inadequacy in objective reality of perfectly functional family relationship operating under healthy boundaries, appropriate for nuclear family independence. The following 2 hours waiting at rural police station while patrol executed rescue operation were period of suspended anguish where I alternated between hope about imminent recovery of Isabella and Miguel and mainly concern about their emotional state after 48 hours under Sylvia's control, during which she probably had begun gradually exposing them to versions of delusional narratives about my supposed maternal inadequacy, planting seeds of doubt about reliability of maternal figure who represented foundation of emotional security, in lives still forming basic understandings about family relationships, and mainly about difference between genuine protective love and psychological manipulation, disguised as legitimate concern with children's welfare. The call finally arrived at 7:15 p.m., informing that rescue operation had been successfully executed without violent incidents, and mainly that Isabella and Miguel were physically safe being transported back to police station, where we could finally reunite with them after 48 hours of absolute nightmare that had completely transformed our peaceful family life into devastating crisis exposing vulnerabilities of child protection systems when kidnappers were close relatives operating under delusional convictions instead of dangerous strangers who dominated popular imagination about threats to children's safety. Officer Sergio explained Sylvia had been detained and was being transported to different police station, where she would be formally processed for parental kidnapping, and mainly where she would be subjected to compulsory psychiatric evaluation to determine if she represented continuing danger or if she could eventually have supervised contact after appropriate treatment restored connection with objective reality. The moment of reunion with Isabella and Miguel when patrol finally arrived, bringing them back approximately 40 minutes after that call, was emotionally devastating experience where I hugged my children with intensity I feared physically hurting them, while uncontrollable tears ran down my face expressing absolute relief about safe recovery, mixed with renewed fury against Sylvia for having deliberately traumatized her own grandchildren through actions based on delusions instead of objective reality. Isabella and Miguel seemed confused and mainly emotionally tired after 48 hours of travel through unknown territory, with grandmother making progressively inconsistent promises about when they could return home and mainly about reasons for sudden separation from safe family routines that had constituted foundation of emotional stability during their entire short existences. Mommy. Grandma Sylvia said you were very busy with work and asked her to take care of us for a few days. But I asked if we could call you, and she said your phone was broken and that you would call when you could. Miguel reported with small voice loaded with confusion about inconsistencies in narratives Sylvia had provided during kidnapping, trying to maintain appearance of normalcy instead of immediately exposing children to complete versions of delusional convictions about family conspiracy. But then today she started saying strange things about you not being good mother because you work a lot and don't stay home taking care of us like she did when you were a child, and I got confused because you always take care of us and are always present when we need you, even when you're working. The revelation that Sylvia had begun exposing Isabella and Miguel to versions of delusional narratives during second day of kidnapping confirmed worrying progression where she was gradually introducing accusations about my supposed maternal inadequacy, probably planning to progressively build psychological case against me through manipulation of children's perceptions about maternal relationship during prolonged kidnapping period. She apparently had planned to last weeks or possibly months until judicial system was forced to investigate allegations and supposedly validate her convictions about parental alienation, justifying permanent removal of children from my primary custody, transferring them to her care as allegedly more competent grandmother, and mainly more dedicated exclusively to children's welfare instead of dividing attention with selfish professional responsibilities. Officer Sergio organized return transport to our city through police vehicle that escorted us during 3-hour drive, allowing me to remain embraced with Isabella and Miguel in backseat, offering comforting physical presence after 48 hours of forced separation while Ricardo coordinated with Dr. Henrique about legal procedures necessary to formalize permanent restraining order, preventing any future contact between Sylvia and children until complete psychiatric evaluation was conducted, determining extent of her psychological compromise, and mainly establishing if appropriate treatment could eventually restore sufficient judgment to allow supervised contact or if relationship with grandchildren would need to be permanently terminated to protect children's emotional well-being against additional exposure to delusional narratives potentially causing lasting psychological damage. We arrived home at approximately 11 p.m. that second night of kidnapping, finding tranquil silence contrasting dramatically with emotional chaos of previous 48 hours, but simultaneously loaded with psychological weight about trauma Isabella and Miguel had experienced during forced separation, and mainly during exposure to Sylvia's delusional narratives about my supposed maternal inadequacy, planting seeds of doubt that would need to be carefully processed through specialized therapy in childhood trauma to minimize lasting damage to fundamental maternal relationship, and mainly to their ability to trust stability of family environment after devastating experience of discovering that even supposedly loving grandmothers could make traumatic choices based on delusional convictions instead of genuine love, respecting appropriate boundaries established by biological parents. The days following that traumatic recovery were dedicated to establishing new routine incorporating regular sessions with Beatrice, pediatric psychologist specializing in childhood trauma, whom Dr. Henrique had recommended during emergency consultation about legal procedures necessary to protect Isabella and Miguel from future contacts with Sylvia, until complete psychiatric evaluation determined if she represented continuing danger or if appropriate treatment could eventually restore connection with objective reality, allowing supervised contact. Beatrice was a compassionate professional of 41 years, specialized in helping children process experiences of parental kidnapping through developmentally appropriate therapeutic techniques, including art therapy, role-playing games, and mainly gentle conversations validating confusing feelings without exposing children to adult details inappropriate about complex psychological manipulations. Isabella and Miguel are demonstrating typical signs of trauma related to parental kidnapping, including increased anxiety about routine separations like going to school, recurring nightmares where they relive experience of being taken by Sylvia, and mainly confusion about reliability of family authority figures after discovering that grandmother they considered source of love and security could make traumatic choices based on motivations they did not understand. Beatrice explained during feedback session with Ricardo and me after third meeting with our children. However, good news is that with appropriate therapy, and mainly with stable family environment you are providing, children of this age generally demonstrate impressive resilience, recovering substantially from traumatic experiences within 6 to 12 months, as long as original stressors are completely removed through restraining order, preventing any contact with kidnapper. Beatrice's comforting words about recovery potential offered genuine hope, but did not eliminate devastating guilt I felt for not having recognized signs of Sylvia's progressive radicalization during previous months, when increasingly critical behaviors about my parenting choices should have alerted me about underlying psychological deterioration, instead of being simply rationalized as normal generational differences about child rearing philosophies. The investigation police authorities had initiated about network of accomplices facilitating kidnapping through provision of refuge at rural property, revealed organized operation involving multiple participants of those online grandparents' rights forums, who had systematically assisted dozens of parental kidnappings during previous years, operating under shared conviction about epidemic of parental alienation, justifying extralegal actions to protect children from allegedly abusive parents. The psychiatric evaluation of Sylvia conducted during week following her detention revealed diagnosis of delusional disorder exacerbated by progressive social isolation after my departure from home to establish independent family, and mainly by intensive participation in online communities that had systematically reinforced paranoid beliefs about family conspiracy, transforming normal differences about relationship boundaries between grandmother and grandchildren into evidence of cruel parental alienation, deserving dramatic retaliation through kidnapping designed to publicly expose my supposed maternal inadequacy, forcing judicial system to investigate allegations that had no foundation in objective reality of perfectly functional family relationship operating under contemporary child rearing paradigms, prioritizing development of autonomy and critical thinking. Ms. Julia, psychiatric team that evaluated your mother confirmed she genuinely believed she was saving Isabella and Miguel from abusive situation instead of traumatizing them through kidnapping, operating under complex delusional system where each normal interaction of your family was reinterpreted through paranoid lens as additional evidence of maternal inadequacy, justifying dramatic intervention. Dr. Henrique explained during meeting about psychiatric evaluation results and mainly about recommendations for Sylvia's treatment and protective measures for Isabella and Miguel. Responsible psychiatrist recommended intensive treatment, including appropriate antipsychotic medication and regular therapy focused on reconnecting with objective reality, but also warned that cases of delusional disorder exacerbated by reinforcement from online communities tend to be particularly resistant to treatment because person developed elaborate belief system mutually validated by group, instead of simply isolated delusions more easily confronted through individual therapy. The explanation about diagnosis and treatment prognosis created moral complexity about how to proceed legally against Sylvia, where part of me desired punitive justice for traumas caused to Isabella and Miguel, while another part recognized she was also victim of undiagnosed mental illness, exacerbated by toxic social influences systematically exploiting psychological vulnerabilities of elderly people, experiencing social isolation, and mainly resentments about changes in family dynamics after establishment of independent nuclear families by adult children operating under different paradigms from those that had dominated their own motherhood experiences decades earlier. Dr. Henrique proposed mediated agreement where Sylvia would accept to submit to intensive psychiatric treatment including medication and regular therapy, agree to permanent restraining order preventing any contact with Isabella and Miguel until medical team confirmed substantial stabilization of her condition, and mainly that she recognized delusional nature of beliefs about family conspiracy, and issue formal statement recognizing that kidnapping was based on distorted perceptions instead of legitimate concerns about my maternal behavior. In exchange, we would agree not to proceed with complete criminal charges that could result in prolonged imprisonment instead of hospital treatment more appropriate for person with diagnosed psychological disorder operating under delusional convictions instead of conscious malice. The agreement proposal offered pragmatic path balancing needs of justice, protection of Isabella and Miguel, and mainly compassion for clearly ill person needing medical treatment instead of simply legal punishment. But implementing agreement would require Sylvia to recognize delusional nature of her beliefs and accept to submit to treatment she had resisted during initial evaluation, when she continued insisting her concerns about my maternal inadequacy were legitimate instead of symptoms of psychological disorder, fundamentally distorting her perceptions of objective family reality operating under healthy boundaries appropriate for independent nuclear family. The following weeks were dedicated to complex mediated negotiations involving attorneys, mental health professionals, public prosecutor's office team processing criminal case of parental kidnapping, and mainly Sylvia's therapist working gradually to help her recognize delusional nature of beliefs that had motivated kidnapping, instead of allowing her to continue operating under conviction that her actions had been justified by legitimate concerns about welfare of allegedly neglected grandchildren, by mother selfishly prioritizing professional career instead of exclusive dedication to children's needs, according to motherhood paradigm Sylvia had internalized during her own experience decades earlier. Finally, approximately 2 months after that catastrophic kidnapping that had completely transformed our peaceful family life into prolonged nightmare of desperate search and mainly psychological trauma for Isabella and Miguel, mediated agreement was formally established where Sylvia agreed to all proposed terms including intensive psychiatric treatment at specialized facility, permanent restraining order, preventing any direct or indirect contact with my children until independent psychiatric evaluation confirmed complete stabilization of her condition, and mainly formal statement that was read during judicial hearing recognizing that kidnapping had been based on distorted perceptions caused by undiagnosed psychological disorder, exacerbated by participation in toxic online communities, instead of legitimate concerns about my maternal adequacy. The statement Sylvia read during that judicial hearing with trembling but apparently genuine voice included formal apologies for traumas caused to Isabella and Miguel through kidnapping. She finally recognized having been devastating action instead of loving protection. Recognition that her perceptions about my maternal inadequacy had no foundation in objective reality of perfectly functional family relationship, and mainly commitment to diligently submit to intensive psychiatric treatment in hope of eventually reconnecting with reality sufficiently to potentially have some form of supervised contact with grandchildren in distant future, if medical team determined such contact would not represent risk of traumatization for children still processing experiences of that kidnapping through specialized therapy. The months following that agreement were a period of gradual and painful reconstruction, where Isabella and Miguel continued regular therapy with Beatrice, demonstrating impressive resilience characteristic of children who possess stable family environment supporting emotional recovery, progressively restoring trust in family routines and mainly processing traumatic experience through age. Appropriate understanding that some people, including close relatives, can make problematic choices based on illnesses affecting thinking instead of genuine love. Respecting healthy boundaries established by biological parents. exercising legitimate autonomy over child. Rearing decisions. Sylvia remained in intensive psychiatric treatment for 6 months, demonstrating gradual progress reconnecting with objective reality through combination of appropriate antipsychotic medication and therapy, focused on deconstructing delusional systems she had developed through months of online radicalization. Eventually recognizing retrospectively that grandparents' rights communities in which she had participated so intensively operated essentially as psychological cults systematically exploiting emotional vulnerabilities of elderly people, experiencing social isolation and resentments about changes in family dynamics, transforming normal feelings of loss when adult children establish independent families into paranoid convictions about conspiracy and parental alienation, justifying traumatic actions against own grandchildren. The decision about whether I would eventually allow some form of supervised contact between Sylvia and Isabella and Miguel after sustained demonstration of psychological stability remained open question. We revisited periodically based on recommendations from medical team, treating Sylvia and mainly on willingness of Isabella and Miguel, expressed through therapy with Beatriz, about whether they felt prepared to potentially rebuild relationship with grandmother, who had caused so much trauma, even if not intentionally, due to mental illness compromising judgment about difference between genuine protective love and psychological manipulation based on distorted perceptions of family reality. 1 year after that devastating kidnapping that had exploded so dramatically into our previously peaceful lives, I finally felt we had achieved some sense of restored normalcy, where Isabella and Miguel demonstrated substantial recovery from trauma through impressive resilience supported by stable family environment and appropriate therapy. Sylvia showed genuine progress in psychiatric treatment, retrospectively recognizing delusional nature of beliefs that had motivated kidnapping, and mainly judicial system had initiated broader investigation of organized network of accomplices facilitating parental kidnappings through those online grandparents' rights forums, potentially preventing similar traumas for other families vulnerable to manipulations by people operating under delusional convictions about parental alienation. The most important lesson I learned through that devastating experience was necessary vigilance about influences of toxic online communities that can rapidly radicalize vulnerable people experiencing social isolation or resentments about changes in family dynamics, transforming previously functional individuals into participants of paranoid narratives that destroy relationships through traumatic actions based on distorted perceptions instead of objective reality. And mainly importance of recognizing signs of progressive radicalization before they escalate to devastating crises requiring police and judicial interventions, instead of simply honest conversations about healthy boundaries and realistic expectations of relationships between grandparents and grandchildren in context of independent nuclear families operating under contemporary child rearing paradigms. Did you like Julia's story? Then subscribe to the channel, leave your like, and comment from where you are watching. Oh, and there's another story waiting for you here on the screen. Click there and I'll wait for you.